This video is a few of the steps that I'm going to take in repairing two vintage quilts that I have. These quilts were brought to me after my mother passed away. These two quilts, I believe, are two of four that had been on our beds as kids that my mom had saved. And one, I had thought they didn't really have wear to the fabric. But on this quilt, this is the second one I was going to repair, and you can see this square has been ripped. Same as this square. My great aunt made these, and she used wool blankets for the batting. So what I have to do, there are spots where a few squares are missing. One side of each quilt has 6-inch squares that actually sew up to 5.5-inch squares. And the other side of each one has 4-inch squares that probably go to 3.5. And you can see there's some damage here, but in this case it looks like it's been cut. And we weren't sure. My mother would never ruin quilts, so we're not exactly sure how it got cut or torn. And they have sentimental value, even though they're probably not worth anything. And I have to figure out the best way to replace the blocks. Now I've cut out my squares already, and this side of the quilt was machine pieced by my great aunt. I don't know what machine she had. It was a vintage Singer, but I don't know what model. And these fabrics, as I look at them, these are familiar to me because even if these were my brother's quilts, we looked at these fabrics for years, and it's so comforting to have an old quilt that you've actually seen before. So if this was my brother's quilt, every time I walked by his room, I would have seen this quilt on his bed, and it just brings back memories, and it's comforting. So here's my square, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the seam allowance in on each one. And this piece is ripped, probably from wear. I'm going to cut away some of it. I'm going to leave the seam there. I'm not going to try to pull the seam out. I'm going to cut away any extra fabric here. And once I have the seam allowances pressed, I am going to hand stitch. In this case, where there's one square missing in that area, I'll do one square at a time. Now on the first side, it'll be easy because I can lift it up. Let me get it a little clearer if I can. And I can hand stitch like that. I can probably do that on two sides. The third and the fourth side of doing that. The third side is going to be difficult. The fourth side is going to be impossible, so I'll have to stitch it from the top with some kind of a blind stitch, and I'm not sure yet how I'll do that. I may even have to do it from the top on the third side. So as I do that, I will I'll have to figure out the best way to do that. And then I'll this area, this is missing 1, 2, 3, 4, and then down further 5, 6. So 4 in a block and then 2 above it. And I think what I'm going to do is do 2 squares at a time once I decide the best way to sew them in. This is the second quilt, and as you can see, there's a lot more damage to this one. But we think that somebody was ill, and perhaps my mother had no choice but to cut a certain area out of the quilt. We really can't figure out why it would have been cut like this. It looks like, in this case, it's been cut along the seams, and she would never have done such a thing. As you can see, that this quilt was tied instead of quilted, and as you can see, the ties are still there. So the fabric was cut away around the ties, which doesn't make any sense, and we can't figure it out. But this is missing about 1.5 strips, this section. And what I'm going to do is, I think I can do one full strip and use a machine to to sew at least one side in place, and then I may have to do the other side by hand. And then I'll also do 2 squares at a time where I can. Some of these look to have wear, like this square does look to have wear, but most of them don't. So we can't figure out why. And you would think I would just cut it up and make something else out of it. But I think because these quilts were on our beds for so long that in our case we think it's worth putting it back together as much as I can. The fabrics I've got, the sun is very bright here, but I've got 6 fabrics that somewhat match. This is one of my squares, set of 2 squares I started. But there are 6 fabrics that will match, and then my dad is going to contribute one of his old dress shirts that he doesn't wear anymore, and I'm going to add that. And what I don't need, I have a lot of this color, I have a lot of this, I have a yard of this, and what's left over I will use to make the 3.5 or 4-inch squares that are on the other side. There's only a few of those that need to be replaced. This one area that you can see there, that's the major damage of the quilt. Here's one example of what I have to do. These 2 squares ripped apart, but they ripped apart at an angle in the red square. So what I've had to do is go ahead and pin 2 raw edges together that are really not wanting to go together without pulling everything else out of shape. But I've got each edge turned under as much as I can, and I'm going to have to hand stitch on the top surface. So this will be an obvious repair to the quilt, and I'm going to make it as much of a blind stitch as I can, but luckily the 2 fabrics are prints. It may not show very much, it may show a lot, but to me it's more important just to get this seam put back together. And there are a few squares that have done that, where the 2 pieces, the 2 squares, are actually mostly intact, and I can just do a hand seam between them. And here you can see what I mean. I'm bringing this needle up through a folded over edge of the left and through a folded over edge of the right. And I'm just going to end up with a blind stitch that puts those 2 surfaces together, and I'll go right up the seam to do that. I finished sewing that seam, and right here you can see it's a little bit uneven, but on the upper half it had actually ripped right on the stitching of when the blocks were originally sewn together. So it's not as bad as it could have been. The stitches are obvious just right in that area for the most part. Once I finish all the pieces I have to do like that and press the quilt, it'll be less noticeable. Plus, it'll be tied here and tied here. They had been tied at the corners, I think. It looks like they're tied at the corners and in the center. So I can tie that there with blue embroidery floss. And that'll keep the seam a little bit more stable. But when it came to, do I have a choice of make this stitch more hidden, or do I grab a good amount of cloth? I grab the cloth, because I would rather it be a seam that doesn't come out than worry about a few stitches that show. I may have to do quite a bit of the quilt just that way that I did it. Quite a bit of the repairs. There's 1 square missing right here. I'm probably going to have to sew that 1 square in the same way I just did that one. And you can see she used a couple of layers here for the batting. That looks like some kind of just wool batting or wool lightweight blanket. This is a regular wool blanket. And you can see her seams here. But I'm probably going to have to put a square right there and sew it in by hand. I've gotten 2 more squares ready to sew in place. I'm going to take this boat and train fabric. I've pressed the seam allowances to the back, and I will hand sew it in this position right here. Excuse the camera for a moment, keeping the seam allowances under as I hand sew it on all 4 sides. I'm going to do the same thing over here with this cat fabric, but you can see that the square that was here before, it's like a very, I don't know if it's gauze or cotton, but there's some of it remaining, and what I'm going to do when I sew this square in place is actually leave that old seam and leave that old fabric and just fit this square over it and stitch at the seam, hand stitch at the seam to put this square in place. And then on this end you can see there's a raw edge above it that I'll turn under and hand stitch in place. And on the bottom here I have about 4 squares missing to the right of here. So then I can make a strip of 4 and do the same thing to fill in the 4 that would have gone there. Just a quick note about the needle that I'm using. This is the needle I've been using to hand sew the blocks in place. And I believe this is a size 7 between or quilting needle. It's the needle that was stuck in my quilting thread, and but if I want to, the size 7, I'm having a little trouble going through some of the older cotton fabrics. These are size 10 quilting needles, and you can see there's a big difference in size, in length, but also in the fineness of the needle. And even though they're short, this might be easier to use. These are vintage needles that my mother had, all regular sewing needles, but they're a little bit thicker. They're very nice heavy needles, but they're a little bit thicker, and for the fineness of the vintage cotton, I think I'm going to switch to a size 10 quilting needle to hand sew the seams. Okay, I want to show you something on the side seam. Here's Miss Cocoa Bean. She's helping. I hand stitched this block in place. There's the seam I had just finished. And when I'm coming down the side, I'm finding that to keep things even in the back, because the back is 4-inch squares, and I kind of want the seams to match up, even though it won't really matter. But I'm having to ease some of this fabric up as I stitch the new square in place. And over here on this side is going to be kind of interesting, because there is about a dime size area of fabric missing. And I don't really want to pull this over too tightly. So when I get to that, I'm probably going to end up leaving a little bit of a gap there. I'll have to see when I get over there. But the way that my great aunt had finished this quilt was just to machine stitch the edges in. No binding, nothing like that. So it's very easy for me to repair it just by stitching the front and the back together. I had this quilt hanging over a wooden clothes rack, and I had been working on it that way. I decided to put it on the floor. These are the squares I've just been working on, and there's the cat square I have to do, and I've pinned 2 in place right there on the left edge, and I figured it's going to be easier I want to get as many on here today as I can. I'm waiting for one fabric to come, which is actually my dad's old shirt that I want to add to this, but I can leave a couple of squares open to add that in, and in the meantime do as many other squares. And I think it's just going to be easier to sit on the floor and get as many on here as possible. There were originally 26 I needed to replace. I've almost got 4 done, so I'm down to 22. I may do random areas like there on the edge, get the bottom edge done, same on the other edge, and it might be easier to do that block of 8 up there all in one piece. So sometimes it's easier to just move the furniture, put the quilts on the floor, and sit down and sew. In my quilt project, the quilt that I'm repairing, my dad has donated an old shirt that I'm going to cut up and use in the blocks. And even though this is only, it's going to be the only solid color in there, it was his aunt that made these quilts originally. So that's the shirt that's going to get cut up and added to the quilts. I have finished replacing all of the 6-inch squares in the top of this quilt, and it looks so much different. It's actually comforting to put the squares in, because when you see a quilt ripped in the middle like that, and you know, it makes you think of, oh no, what happened, you know. But now that all the squares are in, it looks much better. I have just a few on the other side, a few squares to do. The other side is 3.5 or 4-inch squares, and I have just a few of those to replace. And then I'm going to go through, and my great aunt had tied this quilt, meaning that she took embroidery floss and went from one side to the other and then tied that in a knot and cut it. And I believe she did it at the corners of each of the 4-inch squares. It ended up in the centers and at some of the corners of the 6-inch squares. So after I look again at how she actually tied it, I'll go through and anything that's missing, I'll replace. And of course that would be any of the new squares that I've put in. It took about 5.5 or 6 hours to hand sew 26 replacement squares in place. Maybe it didn't take that long. I think it was close to that though, because I went slowly, and in some cases, because the new fabric was different from the old fabric, I had to ease it in. And I just took my time doing it, so I'm sure you could do it faster if you wanted to. But I'm thrilled with this, and when I get the back done, I'm gonna try and edge stitch around the quilt again. That's what my great aunt had done. She had just machine stitched around the edges, and I'm going to do that with one of my machines. She had it right on the edge, like less than a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge, and I don't know how she did that with the bulk of the fabric on the right. So, you know, as you sew, as you go around, I mean, the bulk would be on the left. I don't know how she got that close and such straight edging like that. But I'm going to do that, and then I have another quilt just like it that I have to do that I think needs 18 squares. So when I am completely done with replacing the squares on these 2 quilts and then going around the edges and checking the tying, they won't be anything like new, but they'll be usable, and that's what I was afraid of. I didn't want to have them in a box for storage and not actually use them. I remember these fabrics. The quilt itself has all positive feelings for me, so I want to use them. And so what I've basically been doing is making this one at least, and I will do the other one, making them strong enough to be used again.